started with a scream, the kind of raw, going panic that didn't match the perfectly clipped hedges or color-matched shutters of Maplebridge Estates. And that alone should have been the first clue that something was very wrong, but what happened next would expose more than just a neighborhood disturbance. It would uncover a secret buried so deep that even the FBI hadn't expected it to be cracked open by a woman named Karen with a cell phone and a personal vendetta. If stories like this fascinate you, if you love watching the powerful fall by their own hand, then stop scrolling and subscribe to Sham Stories, because this one has everything. An overreaching HOA president, a mysterious new neighbor, a 911 call that went viral, and a takedown no one saw coming. Maplebridge Estates had always been the kind of neighborhood that prided itself on being problem-free, a place where rules were so tight that even garbage bins had to be placed at exact angles on trash day. And Karen Whitmore had been the self-declared enforcer of those rules long before the HOA board voted her in as president by default. After no one else showed up for the meeting, Karen was in her mid-50s, with ironed polo shirts, pastel capris, and a voice so sharp it could cut through closed windows. She didn't just enforce the rules, she weaponized them. Overgrown grass? That was a $50 fine? Wind chimes that didn't match the community's sound profile. $75. Decorative flags not approved by the HOA style guide? Instant violation. And she didn't issue warnings. She documented infractions with time-stamped photos and submitted them with written citations before most people finished breakfast. That's why when a new tenant moved into 214 Cedar Hollow Lane and didn't immediately register their paint swatches, trash schedule, and window curtain color with her, Karen took notice. His name was Jack. No last name on the mailbox. No HOA paperwork on file. He moved in quietly with no moving truck, just a dark gray SUV and 2 duffel bags. Karen spotted him during her morning walk and instantly flagged the home for non-compliance. But the real problem? Jack didn't acknowledge her. She waved. He didn't wave back. She smiled. He closed the door. That was the beginning. She took it personally. The newcomers need orientation, she told the HOA board, which was really just her and 2 friends who never disagreed with her. We cannot allow rogue renters to disrupt community harmony. Karen began collecting evidence, which consisted mostly of Jack's SUV, parked slightly too close to the curb, his outdoor lights being on past 10 p.m., and the fact that he hadn't attended the last 2 HOA Zoom meetings, which he'd never been invited to. By the end of the first week, she had written him 3 citations, none of which he responded to. Then came the package. On a Tuesday morning, Karen watched from across the street as a man wearing a dark jacket dropped a package on Jack's doorstep and quickly left in a nondescript vehicle. No FedEx, no ups, no logo. Karen, assuming it was drugs or some underground activity, immediately documented the license plate, logged it into her personal HOA suspicious activity spreadsheet, and snapped pictures from her kitchen window. That night, she saw Jack leave his house wearing gloves and a black jacket, carrying what looked like a tactical backpack. He disappeared into the woods behind Maplebridge for nearly 2 hours and returned at 3:14 a.m. the next morning. Karen called 911. "Yes, I'd like to report potential terrorist activity," she said. Breathless, but with the polished edge of a woman who practiced the call before she made it. "He fits the profile. He's secretive. He's receiving strange deliveries. He walks into the woods with equipment. I have documentation." The dispatcher tried to calm her down, but Karen insisted she was keeping the neighborhood safe. The local police arrived that afternoon. 2 cruisers, no sirens. Karen watched from behind her blinds as they knocked on Jack's door. He answered casually, let them in without argument, and they were inside for nearly 20 minutes. When they left, they spoke with Karen briefly at the edge of her lawn. She pressed them for details, but they gave her nothing. "It's under review," one said, professionally vague. But what Karen didn't know, what no one could have expected, was that Jack wasn't some shady tenant. He wasn't a renter. He wasn't even using a fake name. Jack was a covert FBI agent operating under direct federal orders, embedded in Maplebridge Estates to monitor a much larger criminal operation involving encrypted real estate wire fraud, identity laundering, and HOA collusion, SHOA collusion. The Bureau had received credible intelligence that certain HOA leaders across 3 suburban counties were funneling homeowner violations into fraudulent liens, then pushing elderly or non-compliant homeowners to sell under market pressure homes that were then flipped, laundered, or bought by shell corporations. In Maplebridge, it had red flags. Karen's obsessive documentation habits, her refusal to allow board access to finances, her personal server where all violation photos were stored, these had made her a person of interest. Even if she didn't know it yet, Jack was there too. Observe quietly to collect digital forensics and behavioral patterns. But Karen's 911 call changed everything. It forced Jack to accelerate his mission and coordinate with his field team. Because once local police had his name and address on a report, it risked exposure. He filed a federal suppression order that night. The next morning, Karen woke up to find her HOA account locked. She tried to log into the dashboard and was met with a maintenance error. She tried calling the HOA IT provider, but the number was disconnected. She called the HOA treasurer, but he hadn't been active in weeks. She began to panic. Then, without warning, she received a cease and desist letter from a federal legal division sealed official and very real. It accused her of unauthorized surveillance, targeted harassment, and interference with an active federal investigation. Karen froze. She reread the letter 6 times. Her mouth went dry. Then she did the only thing she could think of. She called 911 again. "They're threatening me," she said, but this time her voice cracked. "The man, the one I reported. I think he's retaliating. I think he's FBI." The dispatcher paused longer than usual, then answered simply, "Ma'am, do not interfere. If you've received that notice, you're already involved. Further action on your part could constitute obstruction." Karen hung up, trembling. But it didn't stop there. That same week, a federal agent, real badge, real presence, visited her home. He was polite but firm, asked her to surrender her HOA laptop and any devices she used for documentation. She resisted. She asked if she could speak to a lawyer. He told her she could, but that failure to comply would result in a federal subpoena. She folded. The investigation officially turned from covert to active. Maplebridge's residents noticed. Karen disappeared from her daily rounds. Usual laminated notices stopped appearing. And Jack kept walking, kept driving. But now, people waved, and he waved back. He was still new, still quiet, but somehow more known than ever. What Karen didn't realize was that her obsession with control had accelerated her own exposure. The FBI had weeks of digital logs to parse, including audio clips from a hidden mic she had once installed on a neighbor's fence to monitor excessive dog barking. That mic had captured a conversation she had with a board member in which she casually mentioned pushing out the weird ones before they attract legal trouble. That one line, combined with fraudulent citations, altered document timestamps, and a pattern of fine escalation was enough to build a case. By the end of the month, federal agents served her with formal charges: HOA, tampering, data misuse, obstruction of a federal operation. Maplebridge exploded. Residents gathered on driveways. HOA records were publicly audited. Bank statements surfaced. Karen had paid her own cousin nearly $19,000 through an approved landscaping vendor who never once mowed a lawn in the neighborhood. But the real shock came when residents learned who Jack really was. Not his full identity, but enough. A federal representative issued a statement at a special town hall. The agent was embedded in this community to investigate a series of fraudulent HOA practices. Your cooperation helped make that investigation successful. Jack left Maplebridge the next day, quietly. No fanfare, no goodbye. Just a note slipped under one door. You were right to trust your instincts. Keep the neighborhood safe, the right way. Karen's house went up for sale within a week, but not before reporters showed up at her door. The footage of her slamming the door made the evening news. HOA forums lit up. People cheered. Some wrote angry essays about overreach. Others asked how they could report suspicious board behavior. But for Maplebridge, the nightmare was over. And all because Karen called 911 the wrong man. 3 weeks after Karen Whitmore slammed the door in the face of a local news crew and vanished into what residents assumed was legal exile, the shock in Maplebridge Estates began to settle into something new. Not quite peace, not quite trust, but a strange mix of relief and hesitation, like the moment after a long, deafening storm, when you're not sure if it's really over. Her house sat still and quiet, with the HOA-approved white shutters drawn tightly shut, the once manicured flower beds now browning at the edges. The for sale by owner sign remained in the front yard longer than anyone expected, partly because the rumors about the FBI, the investigation surrounding the property, weren't just whispered. They were shared in group chats, forwarded through email threads, and splashed across community forums by the same neighbors who had once feared Karen's clipboard like it was a badge. The official charges hadn't yet been publicly listed, but everyone knew the truth. Karen had tried to use the HOA like her own private kingdom, and it had backfired spectacularly when she reported an undercover FBI agent to 911. But the part that no one could shake, what truly kept the neighborhood on edge, was that the agent hadn't just been observing Karen. He'd been embedded in the neighborhood for months, possibly tracking more than just her, and no one knew if he'd actually left or simply gone deeper underground. The statement from the bureau at the town hall had been purposefully vague. They'd confirmed the existence of an investigation, praised the community for their cooperation, and then disappeared behind the veil of federal silence. It left people with questions. Who else had been complicit? Were there more targets? Maplebridge really clean now? We're just waiting for the next subpoena. Glenn Forsyth, retired Air Force colonel who had been one of Karen's harshest private critics but most obedient public followers, stepped into the temporary role of HOA board chair. He wasn't charismatic, but he was respected, and more importantly, he was transparent. In his first official act, he sent out a neighborhood-wide email with a password-protected link to view the full audit Karen had tried to bury. The results were ugly. Over $62,000 in unaccounted-for beautification project expenses, a pattern of selective enforcement targeting single renters and newly moved-in families, and multiple complaints from former homeowners claiming they were pressured to sell after receiving cascading fines for things like mailbox tilt and seasonal decorations. But buried deeper in the report was something even more disturbing. Private access logs showing that Karen had been using a proprietary HOA portal feature to monitor the login times of residents. Not only that, but she had exported files containing personal contact info, owning preferences from HOA surveys, and, most chilling of all, internal notes labeled compliance probability, a scoring system she'd developed ranking households by their likelihood to resist enforcement. She had been preparing psychological profiles on her neighbors, turning an HOA database into her own behavioral lab. The FBI's interest made a lot more sense after that. But even with Karen gone, there was still a tension that lingered, especially because of what happened next. Late one night, Glenn received an unmarked envelope under his door. No return. Address no postage. Inside was a single flash drive and a printed note. She wasn't working alone. Glenn, not wanting to overstep, turned the flash drive over to the local precinct, which then forwarded it to the federal agents previously assigned to the Maplebridge case. 2 days later, another agent, not Jack, but someone with the same crisp composure and nameless badge, visited Glenn's home, took a recorded statement, and confirmed that the contents of the drive had expanded the original investigation. They didn't say how. They didn't say who. But it was enough to suggest that the corruption Karen participated in may have involved more people, possibly from outside the community. That flash drive changed everything. The new HOA board initiated a full internal review, this time hiring a third-party auditing firm with no connections to Karen's previous vendors. Residents began coming forward with stories they'd never shared, stories that hinted Karen had been part of something larger. A former HOA secretary confessed that Karen had once demanded she forward certain complaint emails directly to her, without logging them in the official records. A landscaper revealed he'd been paid under 2 different company names, both run by the same man who was Karen's cousin, one woman, a nervous mother of 3. admitted that she'd sold her home at a loss 2 years ago after being visited by an anonymous compliance official, who warned her that her home had been flagged for excessive violations, none of which she'd seen written. It became increasingly clear that Karen's reign had been more than obsession. It had been organized, systematic, possibly criminal. The FBI remained publicly silent but privately active. Neighbors reported seeing unmarked sedans parked for hours in the back lot of the Maplebridge Community Center. One resident claimed he saw an agent scanning mailboxes with a handheld device. The surveillance hadn't ended, it had only shifted focus. Meanwhile, Jack's old rental unit remained unoccupied, but not abandoned. Residents noticed that the grass was trimmed like clockwork, the curtains drawn in a way that revealed just enough shadow to suggest presence. Lights flicked on and off in different rooms each night randomly, but never absent. It was like someone wanted them to know the house wasn't empty, even if no one ever came or went. Some speculated it was still a surveillance site. Others believed it had been converted into a remote operations center, but no one dared approach it. Not since the local teenager tried to sneak a selfie on the porch and was escorted off the property within 5 minutes by a man in a suit who seemed to appear from thin air. Maplebridge began changing. Residents, once passive rule followers, now demanded oversight. HOA meetings were full. Budgets were scrutinized. Voting protocols were digitized and backed up twice. But still something remained off, a quiet hum of unfinished business. Then, exactly 37 days after Karen left, the 911 system in the county registered a new call from a restricted number. The caller didn't identify themselves, but claimed that a former HOA official was preparing to file a civil countersuit in federal court using falsified documentation obtained through unauthorized access. The call triggered a review. The following day, a city clerk flagged an unusual filing request from a legal firm in a neighboring county, representing, shockingly, Karen Whitmore. She was planning a return, not to the HOA, but to the court system. Her angle: she had been the victim of entrapment, manipulated into illegal activity by a rogue federal agent with no oversight. Her goal wasn't necessarily to win, it was to muddy the water, to cast doubt, to regain a shred of control over the narrative. But she'd underestimated one thing: the community had changed. The moment the news broke, residents mobilized. A legal defense fund was formed. Evelyn Grant, the same reporter who had published the first story, returned to Maplebridge with a podcast crew and began producing a multi-episode expose on Karen's web of influence. Jack's name never surfaced officially, but his legend grew. Children began referring to his house as Agent 214. Some neighbors joked about hanging a plaque on the front yard that read, "Justice slept here." But beneath the humor, there was purpose. Residents were done being quiet. They'd learned how to push back. They'd seen what happened when power went unchecked. Most of all, they'd seen what it looked like when justice arrived in silence. With a gray SUV, a duffel bag, and a man who never waved back. Karen's next move was coming, but this time, the neighborhood would be ready. Karen's legal counterstrike came faster than anyone expected. And even though most in Maplebridge believed it was a desperate attempt to salvage her reputation, it still carried enough weight to shake up the community all over again. The lawsuit she filed wasn't just against the HOA. It included Glenn Forsythe personally, the federal government in general terms, and an unnamed agent acting with coercive intent, which everyone immediately recognized as her way of targeting Jack, without having to use his name. She claimed emotional distress, unlawful surveillance, and reputational damage, alleging that she was set up by embedded law enforcement to be discredited and silenced, as though she were some kind of whistleblower rather than the orchestrator of a systemic abuse of HOA power. The media attention was instantaneous. Within 24 hours of the court filing being logged, 2 local stations camped outside her new condo across the county line. But Karen had learned from her last public failure. This time she didn't appear in person. She communicated only through her new attorney, a sharp, media-friendly woman named Madison Gray, who specialized in civil liberties and wasn't afraid of drawing federal attention. In interviews, Madison framed Karen as a concerned community leader who had been manipulated into overreach by forces beyond her understanding. Flipping the script entirely. Karen was a pawn, Madison told one reporter. She was a tool for a greater operation. She believed she was protecting her neighborhood. Instead, she was being studied like a rat in a maze. It was an audacious narrative, and to some outsiders, it almost worked. Members from other towns began posting sympathetic messages online, worried that their own rule enforcement might be twisted into federal interest. But in Maplebridge, no one was fooled. They had lived it. Had seen the forged citations, the silent pressures, the targeting of single mothers, veterans, and elderly residents. They knew what Karen was. Still, the lawsuit triggered mandatory disclosure rules, and that meant the FBI had to respond. Not publicly, but procedurally. Subpoenas were issued. The court demanded anonymized reports related to the Maplebridge investigation. Karen's suit had forced the Bureau's hand, and for the first time, fragments of the operation became accessible through court filings. Redacted documents revealed that Jack's assignment had begun nearly 8 months before Karen even knew. His name, the target wasn't just her, but a network of local HOA leaders who had formed a quiet alliance exchanging legal templates, coordinating citation patterns, and offering vendor referrals that funneled money into shell LLCs. Karen had been just one head of a larger hydra. The revelation stunned the public. HOA forums exploded. Residents across 3 counties began digging through their own records. Several associations froze new citations. A few board members resigned without explanation. But for Maplebridge, the focus narrowed. With Karen's lawsuit active and the neighborhood's safety once again in question, Glenn knew he had to act. He formed a rapid response committee from trusted residents and partnered with the state housing authority to draft a protective charter that would prevent any one person from ever consolidating control again. It included real-time financial transparency, automatic board rotation, and third-party conflict review. It passed with 97% approval. Meanwhile, Karen's lawsuit stalled. The judge, aware of the public pressure and the growing body of evidence, requests for a motion to delay based on national interest. But something stranger happened in the background. The house Jack had occupied 214, Cedar Hollow, was quietly sold. No listing, no sign, no online record. One day it was just empty. The curtains were drawn, the lights stopped flickering, and within a week, a different SUV pulled into the driveway carrying a young couple, who introduced themselves as Carter and Emily Reyes. They said they'd just moved from Minnesota. No one questioned them, at least not openly. But behind the scenes, some suspected the Bureau had restaged the property to keep an eye on lingering activity, especially after one of Karen's former allies, a man named Leo Green, who had served as a contractor for 3 HOA boards, was arrested in connection with wire fraud tied directly to vendor payouts. Evelyn Grant, the investigative reporter who had started it all, released a massive article titled "The Silent Grid: How Local Acts Were Used to Move Millions." It was front-page news for 2 weeks. The story, she outlined how Karen and others had essentially created a loophole in local law, turning fines into liens, liens into distressed sales, and sales into profitable without raising suspicion. From homeowners who didn't understand their rights, reports cited data recovered from devices seized during Karen's investigation, including emails that hinted at her awareness of a broader strategy. "Clean the weak," she wrote in one message. "Pressure, rotate, profit." The phrase became infamous, repeated in HOA reform groups nationwide. Protests followed in several nearby towns. New HOA laws were proposed in the state legislature. And Karen's lawsuit, once her weapon, was now the smoking gun for something bigger. But Karen didn't back down. Even as public opinion turned against her, she appeared on a national news program via Zoom, framing herself as a political prisoner. "If it can happen to me," she said, "it can happen to any board member trying to keep their community safe." The interviewer asked if she regretted calling 911. Her face twitched slightly. "I regret not asking who he really was," she replied. "It's my only mistake." That interview prompted the FBI to issue a rare public clarification. The individual in question was part of a legal federal operation. investigating systemic financial abuse under the guise of homeowner associations. The subject's behavior accelerated the timeline. No entrapment occurred. That statement buried Karen's defense. The judge began considering a dismissal. But Maplebridge wasn't waiting anymore. The community had changed. The fear that once lived behind curtains was replaced with resilience. Block parties returned. Porch lights stayed on longer. Kids played in yards that had once been marked for compliance checks. And still every now and then neighbors would look toward 214 Cedar Hollow with a kind of reverence. No one knew Jack's real name, but they knew what he'd done. They knew that 911 call, made by a woman drunk on power, had backfired so badly it changed laws, reshaped neighborhoods, and exposed a criminal network no one had seen coming. And though Karen's voice was still heard through interviews and legal filings, it was faint, now drowned out by a community that had found its own voice. One evening, during a town hall meeting, Glenn paused mid-sentence and smiled at the crowd. "Funny how we were scared of one woman with a clipboard," he said. "But she should have been scared of us." The room erupted in applause. The story wasn't over. Just when people thought things were settling, another anonymous envelope arrived, this time placed directly on Evelyn Grant's windshield while she was parked at a diner. It contained a photo, grainy black and white. A woman Karen meeting with an unidentified man at a gas station 3 counties away. The timestamp was recent. On the back, someone had written, "She's not finished. Neither are we." Evelyn turned it over to her editor, who contacted federal agents immediately. That photo hinted at more layers, more actors, larger game. Still unfolding? Karen may have been dethroned, but her network had roots. And Maplebridge, whether it liked it or not, was still the epicenter of a story that hadn't yet finished writing itself. The fourth anonymous tip came not to Evelyn, not to Glenn, but to the Maplebridge town clerk's office, delivered in a plain manila envelope marked simply for oversight, urgent. Inside was another flash drive, like the one Glenn had, received weeks earlier, and a stack of printed documents, flagged invoices, internal messages from a private messaging app, and most disturbingly, a scanned HOA violation notice from 2 years ago, signed not by Karen Whitmore, but by someone named T. Henley, a name that had never appeared on any official Maplebridge HOA board record. When the clerk opened the documents, she immediately flagged them and notified both the HOA board and the local police, who escalated it directly to the bureau. That evening, agents returned to the neighborhood, not in secret this time, but openly. 2 unmarked vehicles parked in front of the Maplebridge Community Center, while a small team entered with secure cases and a search warrant in hand. They didn't need to say what it was, for everyone already knew. Karen's lawsuit may have stalled in court, but the information she tried to bury was resurfacing faster than she could contain it. The documents revealed the existence of what agents called a phantom enforcement loop, a system of ghost violations and fabricated compliance warnings tied to shell companies with vague names, like Civic Compliance Services and Unified Living Oversight. These entities, though not directly linked to Karen by name, showed a pattern. They issued citations, sometimes digitally, sometimes as paper mailers with postmarks from counties no one recognized, and in some cases, they coordinated with a fake legal service to threaten liens and demand fast payments via P.O. boxes and prepaid portals. The victims weren't just from Maplebridge. Names from at least 7 other communities across 2 counties showed up in the system, all linked by metadata to the same core list of vulnerable targets: elderly residents, widows, single parents, and those who had moved in within the last year. Most had quietly paid the charges. Some had moved out. One couple in a neighboring town had lost their home entirely after being tricked into believing they were in mortgage default due to HOA noncompliance. The entire scheme was monstrous in its quiet simplicity. It used fear, red tape, and people's trust in official-looking documents to extract money and turn homes into problem properties ripe for lowball buyouts. And Karen's signature, whether literal or metaphorical, ran through nearly all of it. She might have claimed victimhood in interviews, but the paper trail told another story, one of power, pattern, and premeditated exploitation. Evelyn's newsroom confirmed that this wasn't a rogue HOA president gone mad with power. This was an organized financial crime network operating under the legal camouflage of community standards. The podcast covering the Maplebridge case reached the top 10 on national charts. Calls flooded in from former HOA board members who now feared they had unknowingly been part of a laundering scheme. Some admitted they were paid to look the other way. Others claimed they were threatened. Meanwhile, the couple who had moved into Jack's old home, Carter and Emily, abruptly disappeared. Their car gone, porch empty, lights out. They left behind no forwarding address. And neighbors began to suspect what many had whispered from the start. They weren't real residents. They were plants, part of an extended federal presence to maintain eyes on the epicenter. Their exit could only mean one thing: the next phase had begun. Within days, Karen was arrested again, this time not for interfering with a federal investigation, but for direct financial fraud, racketeering, and identity manipulation. She was picked up in a diner parking lot, 3 counties south, meeting with the same man from the surveillance photo found on Evelyn's windshield. He turned out to be Thomas Henley, the name forged on the phantom violation form, and a former municipal consultant with a revoked license due to past involvement in real estate scams. He had been operating under aliases, appearing as a compliance advisor in multiple towns, using HOAs as entry points for exploitation. Karen and Henley were booked together. Their arrest made national news. The headline was bold: HOA Queenpin, an alleged architect of multi-state real estate scam, arrested. Maplebridge celebrated, but quietly. No parties, no champagne. Just relief, like exhaling a breath held far too long. Glenn issued a simple message to residents: "We have weathered something dark. Now let us rebuild something transparent." But despite the public closure, deeper questions remained. Who else was involved? How long had the operation gone unnoticed? How many communities were still vulnerable? The Bureau continued their investigation, this time working openly with local governments to create an HOA watchlist program, a voluntary database that flagged any organization or individual tied to patterns of abuse, financial irregularities, or forced property turnovers. Maplebridge, once just another neat suburban community, became a pilot site. Residents voted overwhelmingly in favor. Every home received a digital badge recognizing them as part of a verified, compliant, and protected community. But Jack never returned. His real name never surfaced, and no official thanked him in public. Still, people left things on his old porch: a letter, small American flag, a cupcake on his birthday. Evelyn had guessed it from a date mentioned in a report. He was the ghost who saved them. The man Karen tried to destroy, who never raised. His voice never made a threat, never revealed his mission. And yet, without him, none of this would have been possible. One evening, Evelyn shared something with Glenn privately. Another envelope had been delivered to her desk. Inside, no flash drive, no photos, just a note typed on plain paper. "The noise has stopped. The message is clear. Don't let it fade." Beneath that was a single symbol: 3 overlapping triangles. Gosh. She hadn't seen it before. She didn't recognize it, but Glenn had. He remembered it faintly from one of the documents reviewed early in the investigation. A classified marker for a now-defunct division of the FBI ION used for internal intelligence operations that never made it into public records. If Jack had used that marker, it meant one thing: his mission wasn't just approved, it was classified above field. The kind of assignment that didn't happen without a direct order. Which meant this entire case, this entire collapse of a criminal HOA empire, wasn't accidental. It had been chosen, targeted, and Karen, in all her arrogance, had thrown the first punch by calling 911. She had walked right into it. As fall approached, Maplebridge settled into a quieter rhythm. The new HOA board ran meetings with open attendance, and every resident now had a secure portal where they could see budgets, track votes, and raise concerns anonymously. Children rode bikes without being scolded for driveway chalk. Flags flew on porches. Dogs barked freely. The neighborhood was alive again, but the scars remained visible in security lights, in doorbell cameras, in the cautious way people paused before opening unmarked letters. They had survived something insidious, something that had weaponized law against them, and they would never forget it. Especially not Karen's final words in court before her sentencing hearing was set. "You think this ends with me? You think this was my idea? You have no idea who you're protecting." The courtroom went silent. The judge cautioned her too. Stay on topic. But Karen only smirked. That expression haunted the front page of newspapers for weeks. And then, in the final twist no one saw coming, Evelyn received one last tip-in, unsigned letter with GPS coordinates. It led her to a storage unit 30 miles outside town. Inside were boxers, labeled by HOA names, years, violation codes, and resale data. Not just Maplebridge, not just Karen. Dozens of neighborhoods, some still active, some long dissolved. In one folder was marked with a word that hadn't appeared in any file before: retribution. Whatever Karen had started, whatever she had been a part of, it wasn't over. But the next chapter was coming, and Maplebridge would be ready to face it. The storage unit discovery unraveled everything they thought they knew about the scale of the operation, because as Evelyn opened box after box, lined neatly with labels, files, digital drives, and even pre-filled violation templates, it became clear that Karen hadn't been a leader of the network. She'd been a mid-level functionary in something much larger, something calculated and deeply organized, and what she built in Maplebridge had been just one spoken and nationwide wheel of HOA manipulation, property flipping, and intelligence laundering that preyed on silence, on rules, on fear, and on communities too trusting to question the forms they received in the mail. The unit had been rented under an alias tied back to a dissolved compliance training organization, one that Evelyn traced to a consulting group that at one point had received partial funding from a now-defunct private security firm with connections to municipal records access and state property tax systems. In layman's terms, someone had built a backdoor into the neighborhood framework every HOA that operated independently and without government oversight had become a ripe target for subtle abuse, asset manipulation, and profit. And Karen had been one of the most aggressive tools they used to pilot the system. The FBI, once looped into the discovery, took full possession of the unit's contents, issued no comment, and placed Evelyn under temporary protective monitoring, though they never publicly explained why. But for those watching closely, it was obvious. The network was real, the stakes were high, and in the criminal reach of the so-called Compliance Alliance, as the FBI began calling it, wasn't just a blip. It was a national infrastructure of exploitation hidden beneath the smiling face of neighborly order, and it had taken one woman's arrogance, Karen's obsession with control, and her impulsive 911 call to trip the alarm that blew it all. Open Karen never took the stand in her final hearing. Her attorney entered a plea negotiation. She received a federal prison sentence of 10 years with no possibility of early parole. And as she was escorted out of the courtroom in shackles, she glanced over her shoulder and muttered just loud enough for the courtroom mic to catch, "He was never just watching me. He was watching all of you." That line became the viral quote of the decade, and she wasn't wrong. Jack, whoever he truly was, hadn't been embedded in Maplebridge simply to catch a rogue HOA president. He'd been assigned there because the entire system was compromised, and that quiet, carefully crafted suburban street had become the test site for how far a corrupted HOA could go before someone finally pushed back. But it wasn't just Jack who changed things. It was every neighbor who stood up, every homeowner who asked questions, every resident who realized that silence wasn't peace, and that being polite wasn't the same as being safe. Maplebridge became the case study for state and federal HOA reform. New laws passed. HOA boards across the country were required to register with state-level oversight committees. Vendor contracts above a certain threshold had to be audited. Digital surveillance restrictions were standardized. Compliance abuse became a recognized civil violation in several states. But even with all those changes, the scars in Maplebridge remained. Some homes still sat empty, properties sold in fear that were never reclaimed. Some neighbors still jumped at the sound of an envelope being slipped under the door, but there was also resilience. Porch lights stayed on later. Meetings were full. Questions were encouraged. And no one ever again received a citation without the entire neighborhood knowing within hours. As for Jack, no one ever learned his real name. His house, at 214 Cedar Hollow, was eventually sold to a retired teacher and his husband. They'd never heard of Karen, of course, but they inherited a street that knew how to protect itself. Evelyn's final report closed with one chilling discovery. A list pulled from the storage unit labeled Active Watch Communities, which included neighborhoods from 5 different states, all with similar HOA structures and similar unexplained property turnovers. Maplebridge had been one of them, but they weren't alone. It meant the operation was still out there, pieces of it still running, some players still unexposed. But if Karen taught them anything, it was that power collapses when people shine a light on it. The lesson was simple: know your rights, question authority, and never assume the person holding the clipboard has your best interest in mind, especially when they smile too much. Maplebridge had been targeted. Then it became a trap. And finally it became the reckoning. One night, long after the dust had settled, Glenn received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photo. It showed a small suburban house, well kept, unassuming. On the back, written in block letters, it said, "This time I'm watching." There was no signature, just a symbol, 3 overlapping triangles. Glenn smiled, folded the letter, and locked it in his desk. Because he understood now, justice doesn't always knock loudly. Sometimes it moves in quietly, watches, waits, and when the time is right, answers the call. If stories like this remind you to never underestimate what's hiding behind closed gates and trimmed hedges, then don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel because truth hides in the quiet, and sometimes all it takes to expose it is one wrong call.